Anyone with an interest in music streamers has probably heard of the EverSolo DMP-A6. In case you haven't though, let's do a quick history lesson. Don't worry, it'll be quick and it is very relevant. The DMP-A6 was EverSolo's first ever streamer, but you wouldn't have known it. It was incredibly impressive in every way. The physical design, the user interface, and the sound quality were all excellent. And then EverSolo upgraded it with the DMP-A6 Master Edition. That version added a linear power supply, better clocks for the DAC circuit, and a better output stage. All very nice upgrades, but it came with a fairly hefty price jump. The standard DMP-A6 cost about $800 US. The upgraded Master Edition cost about $1,200 US. That was a lot more to pay if you weren't going to use the internal DAC. And that is how many people use the DMP-A6, as a streamer only to send out the signal to an external DAC. If you're doing that, having the upgraded output stage, and I think the upgraded clocks as well, doesn't really benefit the sound as a pure streamer. And just to clarify, I don't think the clocks are involved in the clocking of the signal that comes in from your streaming service and goes out the digital outputs, but I could be wrong on that. Maybe there is a benefit in those clocks. Either way though, it was an extra price that some people might not want to spend, again, if they're using an external DAC. And that brings us to the EverSolo DMP-A6 Generation 2. This replaces the original DMP-A6 and it looks identical. From the front, the only way to tell it's different is it says Gen 2 down here. It's priced at $799 US, which is actually a little bit cheaper than the debut price of the original. On the back of the DMP-A6 Gen 2, you'll find a couple of other differences. These changes could be minor or major, depending on how you're going to use the device. Firstly, it now offers a 12-volt trigger output, which means you can have the DMP-A6 switch on your downstream devices, DAC, preamp, amplifiers, headphone amplifiers, etc. It also gets an HDMI ARC input, meaning that you can now connect the DMP-A6 Gen 2 up to your TV and use it for TV sound as well. Those are definitely nice features, but they're only going to benefit certain people for certain setups. And that's why I think the other upgrade of the DMP-A6 Gen 2 is the key. The DMP-A6 Gen 2 now comes with a linear power supply. And what that means is that the Gen 2 version of the DMP-A6 might be as good now as the Master Edition if you're only using it as a pure streamer. It means you can probably spend $400 less and get basically the same performance as a streamer. I don't unfortunately have the Master Edition here. I wish I did. And that means I can't tell you exactly how close they get on performance. What I do have here though is the original DMP-A6. So I compared the two to see just how much difference a linear power supply could make, given that all else about their circuits seems to be equal. Before we get into the testing and results, I'm going to pause for just 20 seconds for a quick message from today's video sponsor. This video is sponsored by Deconi Audio, makers of headphone pads, ear tips, a fantastic modular cable system, and even things like headphone carry cases. Visit deconiaudio.com and use the code PassionForSound10 for 10% off any purchases of all their range of products. For this test, I took the coaxial output from both of the devices and I just switched the cable in between to switch between the devices. In other words, everything else in the source chain, from the DAC through the amps through the speakers, all stayed the same. And it was my normal setup that I use for most of my testing, which is the Burson Voyager preamp and headphone amp, the Burson Voyager timekeeper monoblocks, and the Pro 8 Response D2R speakers. It was immediately evident that the Generation 2 DMP-A6 delivers a more refined and slightly more spacious sound than the original. The differences aren't vast. Remember, the only thing that's changed is the power supply, but the differences are clearly noticeable. The Generation 2 version sounds more mature or more grown up and more refined than the original DMP-A6. It's identical in every other way, and that's why the aftermarket DIY upgrades of the power supply in the DMP-A6 have been so popular. I suspect those people that have done the DIY upgrades are hearing something pretty similar to what I'm hearing from the Generation 2. To see how far those changes went though, I decided to also test the XLR outputs, in other words using the internal DAC. When I hooked these up, that being the original DMP-A6 and the Generation 2, when I hooked those up to the Burst & Soloist Voyager headphone amp and preamp, I didn't pay attention to which interconnects went to which input on the amp. So I basically created a blind test. It didn't stay that way for long though. Within the first 30 seconds of this test, after switching from input 1 to input 2 and back again, it was very clear to me which was the Generation 2 and which was the original DMP-A6. The Generation 2 was once again more refined, more spacious, and had better separation of sounds than the original. And I think this is actually a really interesting test for any of you that are curious or even skeptical about the impact that a power supply can have on a DAC and or a streamer. The Gen 2 and the OG DMP-A6 use exactly the same ESS 9038Q2M DAC chips. They use the same clocks, they use the same output stage, and the change of just the power supply has massively elevated the performance of the Generation 2. The Generation 2 is everything that was already wonderful about the original DMP-A6 with just better sound quality. And speaking of the original, if you're relatively new to streamers and you're not familiar with the DMP-A6, let me quickly give you a run through as to why I think it's probably the very best streamer for under $1,000. As I've already touched on, the EverSolo DMP-A6, whichever version you buy, is a streamer and a DAC with variable or fixed line outputs. It has a gorgeous full color touchscreen display and it supports a wide range of different music apps. That means you can access all of your favorite music services like Qobuz, Tidal, Apple Music, Amazon Music, you name it, it's pretty much there when it comes to the EverSolo interface. And all of those apps are going to deliver bit perfect or lossless playback in terms of whatever's coming from the app isn't getting messed with by the software, the operating system of the EverSolo. Of course, if you're listening via something like Spotify, it's not lossless to begin with, but the EverSolo is not going to make anything worse. Some other devices might mess with the sound, particularly with services like Apple Music. That won't happen with the EverSolo. The EverSolo DMP-A6 can also act as an endpoint for software like Roon or DLNA servers like, say, a JRiver setup. And you can also control playback for local files stored either on an M2 solid-state drive installed within the EverSolo. You have to install it yourself, it doesn't come with it. Or you can plug in an external hard drive or access music on a network storage device. Basically, anything you can think of as an external source of music can go through the EverSolo DMP-A6. Digitally anyway, you can't do phono inputs into this one. In addition to that, the DMP-A6 via its software gives you access to an equalizer or a parametric equalizer and balance controls too. And then if you don't want to use the touchscreen on the device, for example, if you're sitting across the other side of the room, the application that comes with it for your smartphone is excellent. You can either use the controls via the standard application, or you can mirror the screen of the EverSolo DMP-A6, and then it's like having the DMP-A6 in the palm of your hand. Whatever you do on the screen of your tablet or your phone in the palm of your hand happens in real time on the DMP-A6. In short, the EverSolo DMP-A6 and its siblings the A8 and I'm assuming the A10 that I've never tried offer the most polished and enjoyable to use streaming platform that I've tried on the market. To have that same level of polish, ease of use and sound quality be upgraded and be at the same price as it was when it was originally introduced is a huge bonus. And the sound of the DMP-A6 Generation 2 was now so good that I started to wonder if the DMP-A8, which is bigger and more expensive, was a casualty of this upgrade. Had the DMP-A6 caught up to its bigger sibling? The DMP-A8 does have a few extra features such as analog input so you can use it as a preamp. It also uses a different DAC than the DMP-A6. But if you're only using it as a pure streamer, I started to wonder if now the DMP-A6 was the better choice. I started off this time comparing the analog outputs, so I was using the internal DACs of both devices. And thanks to the better DAC chips in the DMP-A8, it still has the edge here. Its sound was more nuanced and layered within the soundstage. Having said that, the DMP-A6 Generation 2 comes across as a bit more powerful and dynamic. That's because the ESS 9038Q2M DAC chips in the DMP-A6 tend to flatten the soundstage a little bit. And that has the effect of bringing all of the details and sounds forward to the front of the soundstage, which makes every detail more available to you as a listener. That can initially be more exciting, but I do find it less realistic in the long run. And so there's no doubt that as a streamer and a DAC, the DMP-A6 Gen 2 has closed the gap with the DMP-A8. But if you're going to be using those analog outputs, I do think the DMP-A8 is still just a little bit better. The key difference being that the DMP-A8 will give you a larger, deeper, and more layered soundstage, which also means you're going to get slightly better sense of separation between the individual sounds and a better sense of where they are in the soundstage. And that was all pretty similar to what I had expected. Admittedly, the DMP-A6 Gen 2 did get a lot closer than I expected, but I wasn't surprised that the DMP-A8 still held a slight edge via the analog outputs. After all, these have completely different DAC stages in them. What I was more interested in though was the use of these as pure streamers, outputting through the digital outputs direct to an external high-quality DAC. For this test, I ran a quality RCA coaxial lead out of the DMP-A6 Generation 2, and I ran an I2S lead out of the DMP-A8. That's another benefit that it has I2S, and so it started off with an advantage in this test. Both streamers were connected to the live micro DDC, and then went onto the live harmony DAC, the Burson Soloist Voyager preamp, the Burson Timekeeper Voyager monoblocks, and the ProAct Response D2R speakers. Suffice to say, both streamers sounded fantastic. The A8 via its I2S output sounded just a little bit crisper than the DMP-A6 did. The DMP-A8 seemed to highlight textures and fine details just a little bit more than the DMP-A6 Gen 2, but there was less space around the sounds from the DMP-A8. The A6 Gen 2 delivered a sound that was more refined, a little bit more spacious, and a little bit better separated. While the A8 may have been enhancing the sense of clarity slightly, the A6 didn't lack any detail or resolution, it just didn't push it. As I switched back and forth over and over, I began to prefer what I was hearing from the DMP-A6 Gen 2. And I think that the upgraded power supply in the DMP-A6 Gen 2 has actually made it the better choice for those of you looking for a dedicated streaming device if you don't need the extra features of the A8. In other words, if you're not going to use the analog outputs and therefore use the internal DACs in these, and if you don't need the additional DSP for room correction that the DMP-A8 offers, the DMP-A6 is the better sounding pure streamer. Having said that, it is very close, so if you do value the extra features of the DMP-A8, it's not like you're getting a vastly inferior device by getting that more expensive one. You're going to get roughly the same sound quality with, I think, a slightly less natural and slightly less spacious sound, but it's very, very slight. You'd never tell the difference unless you compared them side by side. And there's some great features in the DMP-A8 that some people just won't want to live without. But to bring this back to the topic of the video on the DMP-A6 Gen 2, if you're looking for a pure streaming device that has the wonderful interface and the general ease of use that EverSolo is so good at, the DMP-A6 Gen 2 is now a remarkably good buy. And if that sounds like the sort of product that you're after, I'll put some links in the description down below as usual. Of course, if you'd like to get even better sound again and spend about half as much, you might want to watch the pinned video I've got here at the end next. For now though, a huge thanks to YouTube channel members, also to channel Patreon members, and thank you to all of you who leave super thanks on videos like this one. Until next time, happy listening, be kind to each other, and I'll see you here again soon on Passion for Sound.